Being in a log cabin brings back memories for me because I spent part of my childhood in a log cabin. Pastor Sarah, the children's pastor, it brings back even more memories for her having been born in a log cabin. That's right. We were one of those families. Okay, so we are in the first week of this series called Jailhouse Stories, and it's how hard times shape us. And so each Sunday we are going to look at a different Bible character and their experience having gone through a stint in jail, and it's happened to a lot of them. Now, what I want to know is, how do you respond to false accusations? Have you ever been accused of something that wasn't true? Maybe there is something that somebody made an accusation about your character, maybe about a behavior, something you didn't do but they accused you of. How do you respond to a false accusation? I remember years ago one time at a job I was working at, I got accused of being creepy. I got some person in the parts department didn't like me. I have no idea, and so I got talked to by somebody in HR, and I'm like, did they accuse me of doing something? And she's like, no, they didn't like you or something. Well, did I do something? Because you could accuse me of something, but actually make it an accusation about something, not just who I am. But how do you respond to a false accusation? Now we're going to look at the story of Joseph, or Joey, and so this message is about Joey in the clink. Right? Do you know what the clink is? That's as we go through the series, I want to use as much slang for prison as possible. So just for the fun of it, because there's a lot of them out there. So if you remember, Joey was the favorite son. He had a lot of brothers, and his older brothers didn't care for him. Right? That whole favorite child thing, he really played that up, and they didn't like him. And at some point he goes to check on his older brothers, and when he approaches them, they decide they've had enough of their younger sibling, and they decide that they're going to kill him. And they decide, well, maybe killing him is harsh, so let's just sell him into slavery. And so they do that. And he is sold, and he is taken to Egypt. And then this guy named Potiphar, he ends up somehow, the chain of events, somehow he acquires Joseph, and Joseph is now a servant in his house. But as he serves, he excels, and it gets to be the point where Potiphar says, you know what, this kid Joey is so good at what he does, I'm just going to put him in charge of the whole household. And so he is now kind of in charge. But Potiphar's wife found Joseph to be attractive, I guess, and so she wanted to be with him, and when he refused, then she makes a false accusation. So Genesis 39, picking the story up in verse 19. So, and what's happened is Potiphar's wife has made a false accusation against Joseph, and so this is what happens. Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. So he took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison ward. Before long, the prison ward put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. And so Joseph, he's in prison, and I have never been, I've never been in prison, been in trouble like that before. But Joseph finds himself there. And I don't know exactly, we're not told exactly how he responded to the false accusations that got him there. But what we know is, and what we can assume is, how he responded must have been positive, maybe, because it's not long after he's there that he is such a model prisoner, and he's so trustworthy and all of that, that the warden puts him in charge of everything. So I don't know exactly how he responded, but he excelled and was put in charge of his cell block. So my assumption is his response was positive. He must have maintained a good attitude. His love for God must have shone through despite the circumstances he was in. Because what we see in this story is that sometimes the blessings of God can look like the cruelties of men. Right? There are times we find ourselves in circumstances that we don't much care for. And we wish we could just change everything. We wish we could make everything better, make everything right in our eyes. But oftentimes when they're in those circumstances, and it could be a job, it could be a financial circumstance, it could be a health circumstance, you can fill in the blank. But when we find ourselves in those circumstances, it often feels like the world, it feels like the universe, it feels like people are being cruel to us. But often in those circumstances, God has allowed us and placed us in those things because He is using hard times to bring about change in us. He's using those things to shape us into the people He wants us to be. Sometime later, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker offended their royal master. Pharaoh became angry with these two officials, and he put them in prison where Joseph was, in the palace of the captain of the guard. They remained in prison for quite some time. Joseph does about 12 or so years in jail, which is it's a long time, right? I mean, that's a long time. I remember at my 12th wedding anniversary how much it felt like. Just kidding. It's going to feel like a long time this afternoon.
And tomorrow.
While they were in prison, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker each had a dream one night. Now, if you remember the story of Joseph, one of the things that marked him as a person was God had given him dreams and the ability to interpret dreams. And so from an early age, he'd had these dreams. And that's kind of what got his brothers to dislike him is he had this special blessing on him from God, and God had given him these dreams, and he wasn't shy about sharing them. And maybe as a kid and as a youngest sibling, and as he shared it, maybe he was arrogant about it. We don't actually know, but he had these dreams, and so he has this connection. He has this gifting on him. And we see now that in the context of him being in prison, God is still at work, and the things that had marked him as a younger person, because I mean, he's an adult now, right? When he shows up in prison at first, he was probably possibly still a teenager. Late teens, early 20s. And now, sometime later, we don't know how many years this episode here is, but partway through his prison stint, he has this encounter with the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and they had dreams. And so this falls right into Joseph's lap, where this is who Joseph is. Joseph is known for his ability to have and interpret dreams. And so we see, even in the difficult circumstance, God is still using Joseph. And in your life, when you walk through hard times, I believe that in the midst of that, God is still wanting to use you. God is still wanting to shine through you. God is still wanting to let you exercise your giftings and your talents and work through you. And this is what we see in Joseph's life. So Joseph has those guys tell him their dreams. And then he interprets the dreams. And of course, one interpretation was positive and the other one was negative. The one guy was going to be released. The other guy was going to be impaled. So not good for one, bad for the other. But before they get out of jail, before the chief cupbearer and the chief baker are released, he tells them that, "For I was kidnapped from my homeland, from the land of the Hebrews, and now I am here in prison, but I did nothing to deserve it." And so he asks these guys, when you guys get released, remember me, remember my circumstance, remember that I'm still here in jail and I was falsely accused. Because obviously he doesn't want to be there. I mean, who wants to be in a bad circumstance? Who wants to walk through hard times? None of us do. And so Joseph asks them to remember him, but of course they get released. Now one of the guys, to be fair, he didn't have a long time to remember him because he is impaled. The other guy has no excuse, but he forgets to mention anything to Pharaoh. And then it says, 2 full years later, the chief cupbearer remembered when Pharaoh had a dream. So Pharaoh has a dream, and then the cupbearer's like, oh yeah, there's this guy who interpreted my dream. And so it's at that point of the story where Pharaoh has Joseph interpret, and then Joseph goes and is released from jail and then becomes basically second in command or in charge of most of Egypt. And you see again his gifting, the thing that God had given him with interpreting dreams, is used again. Now, what I ultimately think is going on with Joseph is that he's running a lemonade stand. Joey ran a lemonade stand. How many of you guys have ever had a lemonade stand? Some of you? How many of you guys have ever bought lemonade from a lemonade stand? Uh-huh. What's the most money you've ever made at a lemonade stand? Not much? How do you make real lemonade? You squeeze lemons, right? You want the juice that's inside to make it out. Right? See, what is happening with Joey in his life is the things that are inside him are being squeezed out. Right? His leadership abilities, whether he is a servant or a prisoner or in charge of a country, his leadership abilities are squeezed out from within inside him. Right? Everywhere he goes, in the circumstances when they squeeze him, his abilities come out. His ability to interpret dreams in the midst of being squeezed in jail, he still uses them. His story is one where when circumstances are the hardest, what's on the inside is pressed out. Right? His life can be described kind of like a lemonade stand. And what's on the inside is squeezed out. And I want you to think in your own life, when you have faced difficult times, when you have faced hard circumstances, whether it be in school or in a workplace environment or a financial or a health or a relationship, when you were being pressed, when you were being squeezed, what was coming out? Because something was coming out. That's the thing, when we get squeezed, something comes out. And for some of us, maybe it's lemonade. For some of us, maybe it's not. For Joseph, when he was squeezed, we see what comes out. How should you respond to false accusations? Right, we know Joey was accused falsely. And we track his story and we look at it and we're like, how does this guy pull this off? Like, why wasn't he kicking and screaming the whole time? Why wasn't he complaining to God the whole time? Why? It seems like he responded positively. Like he excelled in all of those difficulties. There was something inside him that when pressed came out. 1 Peter 2:23 says, he did not retaliate when he was insulted, nor threaten revenge when he suffered. He left his case in the hands of God, who always judges fairly. Now, in the context of 1 Peter, it's talking about Jesus. But if you read that, you can actually look at Joseph's story and say there's a lot of similarities there. That when he was falsely accused. He didn't retaliate. We have no indication that when Joseph became in charge, when he ascended and was second in charge, he didn't go after Potiphar's wife. Like, she falsely accused him and landed him in jail. And he would have had the means and the authority to go after her. We don't have that story. It seems as if he left his case in the hands of God. 1 Peter 2:21 says, "For God called you to do good, even if it means suffering. Just as Christ suffered for you, he is your example, and you must follow in his steps." I don't know where you're at this summer. I don't know what's been going on. I know that it feels as if we've come out of a long year of difficult circumstances. And now it feels like we're about to be tossed into another long year of difficult circumstances. But whatever is on the horizon, whatever happens, whether it be another storm or something that happens from a government standpoint or something from a health, whatever is on the horizon, whatever bit of suffering that we may step into or see ourselves in the midst of, our example is Jesus. It doesn't matter whether you were falsely accused or you did it. Our example is Jesus. It doesn't matter what the context is. Our example is Jesus. Because Jesus was falsely accused. And he suffered. And he set an example for us. He did not retaliate. He did not threaten revenge. He left his case in the hands of God. Continuing on in 1 Peter. This is the kind of life you've been invited into. The kind of life Christ lived. He suffered everything that came his way so that you would know that it could be done. And also know how to do it step by step. See, Jesus, in his suffering, in his dying on the cross, in all of that, in the false accusations, he was laying out a map for us to follow. Because he promised us that in this world we would have trouble. That when we choose to follow Jesus, it's not an easy path. And he knew that if we associate with him, we would suffer. And so he gave us the ultimate example of how to do that. He never did one thing wrong. Not once said anything amiss. They called him every name in the book, and he said nothing back. He suffered in silence, content to let God set things right. He used his servant body to carry our sins to the cross so that we could be rid of sin, free to live the right way. His wounds became your healing. You were lost sheep with no idea who or where you were going. Now you're named and kept for good by the shepherd of your souls. So I want to tell you this morning that the kingdom of God has gravel roads. How many of you guys grew up in the country? We grew up all over the country. We grew up, but often, it seems like for most of my life, we lived on a gravel road. You city folks who had nice places to ride skateboards and bikes. You city folks who had your roads plowed and taken care of. We lived on a gravel road, and for a long time we lived on a county line road that divided the two counties. And so that meant that if it's was either the first or last to be taken care of. I think it was the last usually. That's what it felt like to me. And this was in northern Minnesota, and Iowa has a lot of counties. They're all real small. Like, you go out for a Sunday drive and you're going to pass like 5 counties and not even know the difference. Minnesota, usually about 5 counties fits into one Minnesota county. But we lived on this gravel road. And if you've never experienced it, I don't recommend it, but you learn some things. You learn how to drive. You learn how to navigate, because every year the gravel road has these seasons where it's just terrible. I got stuck one time on the road. Like, as winter is ending and the frost is coming out of the ground, we get these frost heaves. And there are times when they come up and the road is just covered with basically like these landmines of just mud and muck. And I remember one time, and you're already driving slow because it's muddy, and you're already driving slow because you've got to weave around, right? A gravel, like, sometimes we complain about potholes in the city. You know nothing about potholes on a gravel road. And so you're driving slow, and you're weaving around trying to avoid the worst of them. And so I'm doing that, and then all of a sudden my car drops to the frame and I'm stuck. My tire hit a frost heave that looked like just a flat piece of the road, and it burst open by the weight of the car, and I dropped to my frame. And I could put my arm in up to my elbow around my tire. And I'm like, how is this my fault? I'm on the road. Like, I shouldn't be stuck in the middle of the road. But that's what a gravel road can become. And there are going to be times in life when you're going to be following Jesus, and you're going to feel like you're doing everything right. And you might be doing everything right, and you'll still get stuck. You'll still hit a frost heave. You'll hit a pothole. And it maybe won't seem fair or be fair. But regardless of all of that, what we know is that Jesus told us that we would suffer, and he taught us how to suffer. Do I want you to have to suffer through difficulty? Not really, on one hand, but on the other hand, what I know is that God uses that difficulty, that suffering, those circumstances, he uses that to squeeze out what's inside you. And if there's nothing of value inside you, he will squeeze that out so he can fill you. And if there's stuff of value in you, he will squeeze it out because the world needs to see it. But either way, what I've learned is that suffering and difficulty and those circumstances we don't like to be in are usually the exact thing that we need to go through to grow and learn, and the exact thing that the world needs to see of us go through. There is a world around us, outside these windows, that needs to see somebody suffer the way Christ suffered, with the same dignity and attitude that Christ had. They need to know that our faith is real, and they won't know our faith is real when everything is easy. They'll know our faith is real when we suffer the way Christ suffered. So do I want you to go through hard times? Part of me says yes, because I know the result of it. And I know the result is what God wants. Matthew 5, 10 through 12 from the Message says this. You're blessed when your commitment to God provokes persecution. The persecution drives you even deeper into God's kingdom. That when you go about your day-to-day life and you are trying to live for Jesus and do the right things, and that causes you to suffer, that suffering, it says, drives you deeper to God. And I think a lot of us could attest to that. A lot of us could say, you know what? I didn't really grow that much when everything was easy. But when I had to walk through that difficult season, when I look back at it, that's when I grew. That's when my faith was shored up. That's when I knew my faith was strong enough to carry the weight. And we don't learn those things in an easy time. We learn them in a hard time. Not only that, count yourselves blessed every time people put you down or throw you out or speak lies about you to discredit me. What it means is that the truth is too close for comfort and they are uncomfortable. You can be glad when that happens. Give a cheer even. For though they don't like it, I do. This is Jesus speaking to his followers, and he's telling them that when following me causes other people to dislike you, try to discredit you, or call you things, he is cheering because he recognizes what's going on. He recognizing that there is this collision that is happening. This collision between those who are seeking Christ and those who are offended by the cross. And Jesus is inviting the collision forward. Because it's at that point of collision that we are forced to make decisions. Am I going to follow Christ or reject Christ? You can be glad when that happens. Give a cheer even. For though they don't like it, I do, and all heaven applauds. And know that you are in good company. My prophets and witnesses have always gotten into this kind of trouble. If we're going to follow Jesus, we are going to step into trouble. Not trouble necessarily of our own making. Not trouble because we did something wrong. But if we follow Jesus, it's coming your way. What did Joseph do that was so wrong? Nothing. And as we go through this series of jailhouse stories, you're going to see over and over and over again that the people who follow Jesus, who follow God with a strong conviction and a strong commitment, find themselves in the most difficult circumstances, not because they did something wrong, but because they lived for God, and the world didn't like it. But something very cool happens in Joseph's story. When you read Joseph's story, and I forget how many chapters it is, it's a lot of chapters. You start back in Genesis 39, 38 or so, and you track through 7, 8 chapters. And we get Joseph's story from the time he is a child, from the time he is maybe a young teenager. We get his story all the way through adulthood until later in his life. But one of the things that has always stood out to me in his story is not the fact that God had given him dreams, not the fact that he was necessarily mistreated, not the fact that he became like a world leader. The thing that has always stood out to me as possibly the most important thing that happened in his story is in Genesis 39:21. And I read it earlier. When Joseph is falsely accused by Potiphar's wife and is put in jail, this verse just kind of pops up and you almost gloss over it. But it's the only time this is said of Joseph in his story. It says, "But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love." And you won't find that sentence in Joseph's story anyplace else. Did God show his faithful love to Joseph all through Joseph's life? I'm certain of it. But where the Bible makes special mention of it is in the midst of the hardest thing that Joseph finds himself in. That when Joseph is in prison in a foreign country, having been kidnapped, sold, became a slave, falsely accused. It's in that circumstance that I think Joseph, for maybe the first time in his life, understands the depth of God's love for him. God showed his faithful love. He didn't change the circumstances immediately, though, right? Joseph is shown God's love, and he's still in jail. And he'll be in jail for another 8 to 10 years. But God showed him his love in the worst of circumstances. And to me, that stands out above almost everything else in Joseph's story. And that's what I want for your story. I want for you to be in a circumstance where you understand the depth of God's love for you. And often those aren't the easy circumstances. Those are often the times when life is the hardest. And there's some shift that happens in us. And it's in those moments that we feel and know the love of God deeper than we ever have. See, I think God has a lemonade stand. I think God has a lemonade stand, and you're all one of the cups. And in his lemonade stand, he sees us, and he loves us, and he knows us, but he wants us to become more and more like him. And so he is going to allow us to be squeezed, because he wants to empty out everything of us so that there's enough space for him. And when we have enough space for him, he wants to squeeze us again, because the world around us needs to see that. They need to see that when we are squeezed, that the love of God still comes out of us. God has a lemonade stand, and you're in it. I'm going to invite Mark, you want to come up and play some? We're getting ready to wrap this service up. And as we close, I just want to acknowledge that this has been a difficult season. We've, not just Marshalltown, but especially, because that's where I live, Marshalltown, we've gone through it, right? With the storms and the tornadoes and stuff that's happened in our school district recently, we're in a rough season. We're in some difficult circumstances. And I believe that as one of the churches here in Marshalltown, God is letting us walk through that because he is squeezing us so that the world can see him in us. So I want to invite let's have John and Ryan and some of the ladies from the worship team, or the prayer team. I want to invite you guys up front here. Steve, why don't you come up too? And as they're coming up front, as we close, I just want to invite you guys, if you need prayer, if you would look at the circumstances you've gone through in the last 6 months, month, year, and if they've been difficult, and you would like somebody to pray with you, I would invite you up. If maybe you look at the circumstances you've gone through, and you say to yourself, I don't know what came out, but I want more of God to come out the next time. I want to invite you up front to pray. So I'm gonna kind of close in prayer. And if you're in that circumstance and you want more of God to come out, just come up and spend a few moments in prayer. Let's pray. Dear Father, and Joseph's story is difficult. I wouldn't want to be him. I don't want to be falsely accused. I don't want to walk through hard times. But I do want to be a cup in your lemonade stand. And so if it requires me to have a difficult season, make me ready for it, God. Make me ready for it.